The wind cut through Blackwood Ridge like a serrated blade sharp enough to draw blood from exposed skin in under a minute. Thomas Reed stood at the southern edge of his 40 acres breath, crystallizing in the October air, studying the slope with the methodical gaze of a man who'd spent 4 decades calculating load-bearing tolerances. The topographic map trembled in his left hand. His right gripped a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm an hour ago. 62-years-old knees that clicked like rusted door hinges when he crouched in a bank account bleeding down to 4 figures. The math was simple. He had 5 weeks before the real cold arrived. 5 weeks to dig into frozen Montana earth and build something the textbook said was impossible. Behind him, the rusted Airstream trailer sat at a drunken angle on the access road, one wheel sunk into mud that had frozen overnight. He'd slept there last night, waking every hour to the propane heater's death rattle, seeing his breath fog the aluminum ceiling. This morning, he'd scraped frost from the inside of the windows. The thermometer mounted outside read -15. It was only October 23rd. By January, this ridge would see -40, maybe worse. Most men would call that a death sentence. Thomas saw it as a design parameter. He'd purchased this land 3 weeks ago for $85,000, the liquidated guts of his 401k in the Seattle house he'd sold in August. The deed described it as agricultural vacant land last surveyed in 1955. Clark Patterson, the local surveyor who'd handled the paperwork, had leaned back in his office chair with the casual posture of a man delivering bad news he'd delivered before. The land was cheap for a reason, Mr. Reed. Soil's rocky, water tables deep. You planning to run cattle, you'll need to drill 800 feet for a well. Thomas had signed anyway. He didn't need cattle. He needed 12 feet of vertical excavation and a south-facing slope at 46 degrees north latitude. The theory had consumed him for months, sketched first in the margins of structural reports he should have been reviewing during his final year at the firm. The zero-input thermal flywheel. Passive solar gain through glazing. Thermal mass absorption during daylight hours. Radiative heat release through the night. Insulation extending outward from the structure like an underground umbrella, keeping the earth itself warm and dry. No furnace, no wood. No monthly utility bill that climbed higher each winter while his salary stagnated and then vanished entirely when the firm restructured him into unemployment at age 61. Margaret had understood, or at least she'd pretended to understand during those last months before the aneurysm took her in May. She'd sat at their kitchen table in Seattle looking at his hand-drawn schematics, tracing the lines with one finger. "You want to live in a cave, Tom?" He'd tried to explain it wasn't a cave. It was a battery. She'd smiled the kind of smile that said she loved him even when he sounded insane. "Just promise me it'll be warm," she'd said. "I hate being cold." He kept that promise in his chest now, a stone that weighed exactly what a wedding ring weighed when you took it off for the last time and put it in a box because wearing it felt like lying to yourself about who was still alive. The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from the thought. A white F-250 with county plates crawled up the access road, suspension groaning over the ruts Thomas's own truck had carved. The driver's door opened, and Clark Patterson stepped out, followed by a second man Thomas hadn't met. Tall, angular, wearing a canvas jacket too light for the temperature and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the weak sun. He had the posture of someone who expected to be listened to. "Morning, Mr. Reed." Clark's voice carried that false warmth people used when they wanted something. "This is Councilman Richard Webb. He wanted to come out and see what you're planning." Thomas set the thermos down on a flat rock and walked toward them, boots crunching through the frozen crust. He didn't offer his hand. Webb didn't either. They stood 10 feet apart, 3 men exhaling steam in the cold, reading each other. "Your permit application says agricultural storage." Webb's voice was measured, almost academic. "Under 500 square feet, exempt from commercial building codes." "That's correct, but you're living here." Webb gestured toward the Airstream. "That changes the classification. If this is a residence, even temporary, you need inspections. Foundation depth, egress windows, septic approval." Thomas felt the tightness in his chest that had been there since Margaret died, the constant low-grade panic of a man standing on the edge of a cliff he couldn't see the bottom of. "I'm camping while I build storage for equipment. Once it's finished, I'll move back to town." The lie tasted like copper. He had no intention of moving anywhere. This ridge was the last place on earth he had any claim to. Webb pulled a folded paper from his jacket and held it out. Thomas didn't take it. "I'm giving you a courtesy visit, Mr. Reed. The building inspector will be out next week. If your structure doesn't meet code, I'll have to issue a stop work order. First snowfall is usually mid-November. That gives you about 3 weeks." The words hung in the cold air. Thomas watched Webb's eyes, looking for the real message beneath the bureaucratic polish. What he saw was something harder. This wasn't about code enforcement. This was about something else, something Webb wasn't saying out loud. Clark shuffled his boots, uncomfortable. "Richard, maybe we should let Mr. Reed get back to work. He's got a lot to do." Webb folded the paper and tucked it back inside his jacket. "Just want to make sure everything's safe, Clark. We've had enough tragedies in this county without adding frozen retirees to the list." They drove away, the F-250's taillights disappearing around the bend. Thomas stood in the silence they left behind, listening to his own heartbeat. The ridge didn't care about county councilmen or building permits. The ridge was 400 million years of sedimentary stone, compressed, enfolded, and thrust upward by forces that made human concerns look like dust motes in a spotlight. He turned back to the slope and started walking. The backhoe sat where he'd left it yesterday, rented from a place in Billings that had taken his credit card deposit with the bored efficiency of people who rented equipment to optimists every day. Thomas had never operated one before last week. The controls felt greasy and imprecise, but he'd managed to scrape away the topsoil in a rough rectangle, exposing the layer beneath. The geological survey he'd ordered said this should be compacted loam easy digging once you got past the frost line. What he'd found instead was shale, hard fractured rock that sparked when the bucket hit it. He climbed into the cab and turned the key. The diesel engine coughed, belched black smoke, and settled into a grinding idle. He lowered the bucket and pushed it into the earth. The hydraulics whined. The bucket scraped, bit, caught on something solid. He tried again, angling differently. This time he pulled up a scoop of broken rock and something else. Concrete, old, weathered, with rusted rebar poking through like broken bones. Thomas killed the engine and climbed down. He knelt at the edge of the hole, brushing dirt away from the concrete with his gloved hand. This wasn't random debris. It was a slab poured deliberately, maybe 3 feet down. He grabbed the pickaxe from his truck bed and swung it overhead, bringing it down with all the force his shoulders could generate. The concrete chipped. A crack spider-webbed across the surface. He swung again. The crack widened. On the third swing, a chunk broke free and tumbled into darkness. Darkness. Thomas leaned forward, peering into the gap. Cold air drifted up, carrying a smell he couldn't place. Not the clean mineral scent of stone, but something organic, stale. He pulled his phone from his pocket to use the flashlight, but the screen showed no signal and 12% battery. He'd forgotten to charge it last night. He went back to the truck and found the heavy mag light he kept in the toolbox. The beam cut through the dust and revealed what he'd broken into. Not solid earth, a void, a chamber. He could see the top of a stone wall roughly mortared, and beyond it, empty space. His heart hammered against his ribs. This land was supposed to be vacant. The county records went back to 1955. Nothing before that except vague references to mining claims that had been abandoned. He thought about Webb's visit, the timing too convenient to be coincidence. The rational choice was to cover it up, call the surveyor, maybe call the county, ask questions. But rational choices were for people who had time and money and options. Thomas had none of those. He looked at the sky, 4 in the afternoon, light already fading. He should stop. Go back to the Airstream, heat up the canned soup he'd bought at the gas station, sleep. Instead, he picked up the sledgehammer and swung it at the concrete cap. If there was a void down there, it meant less digging. It meant he was ahead of schedule. It meant maybe, just maybe, the universe was giving him something instead of taking. By the time the sun touched the western peaks, he'd cleared a hole large enough to lower a ladder through. He went down carefully, testing each rung. The air grew warmer as he descended. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surface. At the bottom, 12 feet down, he stepped onto packed dirt and turned in a slow circle with the flashlight. The chamber was larger than he'd expected. 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, walls made of river stone, mortared together in the old-style floor of hard-packed earth. The ceiling was timbered with rough-hewn logs, blackened with age, but still solid. Along the back wall, he could see the stones were darker, almost wet-looking. He walked over and pressed his hand against them. Warm. Definitely warm. He pulled out the laser thermometer he'd brought and aimed it at the wall. 58 degrees Fahrenheit. That was impossible. The surface temperature was -15. Ground temperature at this depth should be around 52 degrees, maybe 54 this time of year. 6 degrees might not sound like much, but in thermodynamics, 6 degrees was a fortune. A sound stopped him, faint rhythmic, like metal scraping against stone. He held his breath and listened. It came from behind the back wall, muffled by the thickness of the rock. Then silence. He waited 3 minutes by his watch. Nothing. Just the settling of old timbers, the slow music of earth adjusting to new weight. Thomas climbed back up and sat on the edge of the hole as darkness settled over the ridge. His legs dangled into the warmth below. He thought about Margaret, about the last coherent thing she'd said before the stroke took her speech. She'd been in the garden pulling weeds, and she'd straightened up and looked at him with absolute clarity. "You're going to be okay, Tom. You always figure it out." Then she'd gone back to the weeds, and 30 seconds later, she'd collapsed, and 3 days after that, she was gone. He hadn't figured anything out since then. He'd just been moving one decision after another, each one burning a bridge he couldn't cross back over. Selling the house, draining the retirement account, driving away from Emily's apartment in Seattle while she stood on the sidewalk crying, begging him not to do this. But sitting here now, feeling warm air rise from a hole he dug into the Montana wilderness. He thought maybe this was what figuring it out looked like. Maybe it looked like falling forward until you hit something solid. The next morning, Thomas was back in the hole by 7, working by LED lantern, because dawn wouldn't break until after 8. He'd brought tools, hammer, chisel, crowbar, a carpenter's level. If he was going to use this space, he needed to understand it. He started with the walls, tapping them with the hammer, listening to the sound. Solid, well-built. Whoever had constructed this had known what they were doing. The floor concerned him more. Dirt was a terrible insulator unless it was bone dry, and moisture would wick heat away faster than he could generate it. He'd need to pour a concrete slab 8 inches thick, at least mixed with fly ash to increase thermal density. That meant hauling in bags of cement, renting a mixer, doing the work himself because he couldn't afford to hire anyone. He was measuring the dimensions when he heard boots on the gravel above. 2 voices, one young, one older. He climbed the ladder and found 2 men standing beside his truck. The younger one was maybe 28, red-haired, wearing work pants and a canvas jacket with a Marine Corps insignia on the shoulder. The older one was 60-plus, barrel-chested, face like weathered leather. The redhead stuck out his hand. "Jake Morrison, this is Dale Kramer. Clark Patterson said you might need some help digging." Thomas shook Jake's hand, then Dale's. Dale's grip was careful testing. "You're the engineer from Seattle," Dale said. "The one building the solar cave." Word traveled fast in small counties. Thomas gestured toward the hole. "I'm building thermal mass storage, not a cave." Jake walked to the edge and peered down. "Holy hell, you find a mine shaft, something like that." Thomas pulled off his gloves. "I'm paying 20 an hour. Cash. Works hard, and I can't promise it'll last more than a few weeks." Dale and Jake exchanged a glance. Jake nodded first. "I'm in. My wife's pregnant, due in January. We could use the money." Dale took longer to answer. He walked around the hole, studying it from different angles. Then he knelt and picked up a chunk of the concrete Thomas had broken away. He sniffed it. When he looked up, his eyes were different. Worried. "Mr. Reed, how deep does this go?" 12 feet to the floor. Why, Dale stood and brushed dust from his knees. "I worked the Blackwood mine for 30 years before they shut it down. Closed in 57, right after I got hired. They said the seam was tapped out, but that was horseshit. They closed because of the fire." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Fire coal seam fire. Started in 56, maybe earlier. Company tried to seal it off, but coal burns underground for decades once it gets going. You ever hear of Centralia, Pennsylvania, been burning since 1962? Whole town had to evacuate. Jake looked between them. "You think there's a fire under here?" Dale dropped the concrete chunk. "I think there might have been one nearby. This concrete cap, the way it's poured, that's not a foundation. That's a seal. Someone tried to close off whatever's down there." The 3 of them stood in silence. Thomas thought about the warmth he'd felt, the 58-degree reading on the back wall. He thought about Webb's visit, the too convenient timing. If there was a fire, Thomas said slowly, it would explain the temperature anomaly. Dale nodded, and it would explain why this land was cheap. Jake kicked at the dirt. So what do we do? Thomas looked at the hole, then at the ridge behind them, then at the airstream, where he'd spent another night watching his breath freeze. He thought about Emily's voice on the phone 2 nights ago, telling him she'd talked to a psychiatrist about involuntary commitment, asking him to please just come home. He thought about the empty house and saddle that belonged to someone else now, and the job that didn't exist, and the wife who was ash in an urn in the back of his truck because he hadn't figured out where to scatter her yet. We dig, he said, but we're careful. We monitor temperature. We don't go deeper than we need to. Dale studied him for a long moment. Then he spat into the dirt. All right, but if I smell sulfur, I'm out. I don't care how much you're paying. They started that afternoon. Jake proved to be quick and strong, learning fast, asking questions about the physics Thomas was trying to harness. Dale worked with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades underground. But Thomas noticed he kept stopping to sniff the air, to press his hand against the stone walls testing. By the end of the first week, they'd cleared enough of the chamber to start framing. Thomas had designed the south wall to hold glass at a 45-degree angle, maximizing winter sun exposure. The calculations were straightforward. At 46 degrees north latitude, the sun's angle on the winter solstice would be 20 degrees above the southern horizon at noon. A 45-degree glazing would catch that light, nearly perpendicular maximum energy transfer. The problem was the glass. He'd ordered custom triple-pane polycarbonate panels from a supplier in Missoula, but the confirmation email that arrived Monday morning made his stomach drop. Supply chain delays. Estimated delivery pushed back 3 weeks. He'd be lucky to get them by Thanksgiving, which meant installation in December, which meant working in sub-zero temperatures to seal something that needed to be airtight. That night, he sat in the airstream with his laptop, searching for alternatives. The propane heater sputtered, and he could see his breath in the blue light from the screen. His fingers were too cold to type accurately. He made 4 typos searching for emergency glazing materials and wanted to put his fist through the aluminum wall. Instead, he drove to town the next morning and bribed the attendant at the county dump with $50 and a pack of Marlboros. The kid's name was Justin, 19 years old, bored enough to let Thomas scavenge if he didn't take anything the county could sell for scrap. Thomas found them in the back corner, stacked against the fence. Shower doors, dozens of them tempered glass, still in decent shape, casualties of a hotel renovation in Billings. They were smaller than what he'd planned, which meant he'd need more of them, which meant more seams to seal. But they were free, and they were here, and they were glass. You building a greenhouse, Mr. Reed? Something like that, Thomas said, loading the heavy sheets into his truck bed. Jake helped him haul them back to the site. Together, they built a timber frame from lodgepole pines Thomas had felled on the northern edge of his property. He'd treated the vines with linseed oil, the smell sharp and medicinal in the cold air. They angled the frame at exactly 45 degrees, checking and rechecking with the level. Then came the tedious work of cutting the shower doors to fit, sealing them together with marine-grade silicone. It looked terrible, a patchwork quilt of mismatched glass, some panels frosted, some clear, some with etched patterns of bamboo or geometric designs. Dale stood back and shook his head. That's the ugliest window I ever saw. But it's airtight, Jake said, running his hand along a seam. And it'll work, right, Thomas? Thomas was watching the afternoon sun hit the glass, studying the way light bent and scattered through the layers. It'll work. By November 14th, the cave was enclosed. Thomas stood inside for the first time with the doors sealed, watching dust motes dance in the light. He'd mounted a thermometer on the back wall, the kind with a large analog dial that didn't need batteries. Outside, temperature 28 degrees. Inside, the needle climbed. 40, 42, 45. The greenhouse effect was real, measurable, undeniable. That evening, he moved his cot from the airstream into the shelter. He didn't bring the propane heater. This was the point of no return. If the physics were wrong, if the thermal mass couldn't hold enough heat through the night, he'd wake up hypothermic. Or he wouldn't wake up at all. He lay in the dark, listening to the silence. It was different from the silence outside. Heavier, more complete. The wind couldn't reach him here. The cold couldn't find him. He thought about Margaret, about the summer they'd driven to Montana for a camping trip 20 years ago. She'd hated the tent, hated sleeping on the ground, hated the way the temperature dropped 40 degrees after sunset. I don't understand people who choose to freeze, she'd said, shivering in her sleeping bag. Give me a house with central heating and I'm happy. He'd told her she was soft and she'd laughed and agreed. "But you love me anyway," she'd said. And he'd said yes, he did. He really did. Around 2 in the morning, he woke to a sound. Scritch, scritch, metal on stone, rhythmic and deliberate. It came from the back wall, the one made of river rock and old mortar. He clicked on the flashlight and aimed it at the source. The beam cut through darkness and caught nothing but stone and shadow. He got out of his sleeping bag, shivering. Not from cold. The thermometer read 68 degrees. He was sweating. 68 degrees at 2 in the morning. The thermal mass was working beyond his calculations. The stone had absorbed so much heat during the day that it was radiating it back now, a slow battery discharge that would last for hours. But the joy of success was drowned by the noise. He walked to the back wall and pressed his ear against the cold stones. Silence. Then a low rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, like machinery. He backed away, mouth dry, just settling, just the earth adjusting to the weight of the structure, just thermal expansion and contraction, just physics. He repeated it like a mantra until his own heartbeat slowed. The next morning, the trouble arrived in a white SUV with government plates. Richard Webb stepped out and Clark Patterson followed. Thomas watched from inside the shelter, looking through the patchwork glass. Webb walked up to the south wall and tapped it with a pen. The sound echoed. Thomas opened the door. "Morning, Councilman." Webb didn't acknowledge the greeting. "This isn't a root cellar, Mr. Reed. This is a habitation. And that glass is not to code. If a heavy snow load hits this, it'll shatter and decapitate you. It's tempered. Stronger than standard plate glass. It's trash." Webb pulled a red piece of paper from his jacket. "I'm giving you a cease and desist. You have 48 hours to vacate this structure, or I'll have the sheriff come out here and bulldoze it." Thomas felt the words like a physical blow. "You can't do that. I can. And I will. A storm is coming, Mr. Reed. If you're smart, you'll pack up and go back to Seattle while you still can." Webb shoved the paper against Thomas's chest and let it drop. It fluttered to the frozen ground. Clark wouldn't meet Thomas's eyes. The two men got back in the SUV and drove away, tires crunching over gravel. Thomas stood in the wind, the red paper at his feet. He looked at the sky. The clouds were turning at a bruised purple. The air smelled like ozone and ice. The storm wasn't coming in 48 hours. It was coming tonight. He picked up the paper and crumpled it. He went back inside and locked the door. If they wanted him out, they'd have to drag him. That afternoon, he activated the secondary system. The biomass pile sat in the corner, a mound of wood chips soaked in water and mixed with horse manure he'd bought from a rancher 15 miles south. Buried inside was a coil of PEX tubing that ran through the concrete floor. The concept was simple. Decomposing organic matter generated heat, massive heat up to 150 degrees in the center of a well-built pile. By circulating water through it, he could turn the floor into a radiator. He turned the valve. The small solar-powered pump whirred to life. He sat on his cot and waited, watching the thermometer. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Huge, heavy flakes that stuck to the glass and accumulated fast. Inside, the temperature gauge read 72 degrees. But as the pump circulated water through the rotting compost, the air began to change. It didn't smell like fresh earth or mulch. It smelled like sulfur, rotten eggs. And from behind the back wall, the scratching started again, louder this time. Scritch, scratch, scritch. Thomas stared at the wall. The mortar between two of the large stones was crumbling. Not from age, it was being pushed out. Something was behind the wall, something that had been quiet until the heat woke it up. He stood and walked to the wall, crowbar in hand. The scratching stopped. He waited. Nothing. He pressed his hand against the stone. It was hot. Too hot. He aimed the laser thermometer. Error. High. The device maxed out at 120 degrees. The heat wasn't coming from his biomass pile. It wasn't coming from the sun. The heat was coming from behind the wall, from deep in the earth, from whatever had been burning since 1956. Thomas backed away slowly. He thought about Dale's warning. He thought about Webb's convenient visit. He thought about the concrete cap he'd broken through the seal someone had poured to keep something contained. And he thought about the fact that he had nowhere else to go. Outside, the blizzard hit with the force of a physical thing, wind slamming against the glass, snow piling up in drifts that buried the lower half of the south wall. Inside, the temperature climbed to 91 degrees. Thomas stripped down to his undershirt, sweat running down his spine. He'd built a shelter to capture heat. He'd succeeded beyond his wildest calculations. The problem was he couldn't turn it off. The storm lasted 3 days. Thomas rationed water from the 5-gallon jugs he'd stored, ate granola bars and canned peaches, and watched the thermometer climb to 96 degrees before he shut off the biomass circulation entirely. It didn't matter. The heat kept rising. On the second night, when the wind was loudest and the snow had buried his truck to the wheel wells, he heard a sound that made him forget about the temperature. Crack. Sharp like a gunshot. A fissure zigzagged up the center of the backwall, mortar dust puffing out in small clouds. Thomas scrambled for the crowbar, heart hammering. The air pressure shifted. His ears popped. Outside, the storm was a muffled roar. Inside, something hissed like a pressure valve. The wall groaned. The stones in the center bulged outward. With a heavy thump, the center section collapsed inward, not into the room but through the floor, revealing a jagged opening 3 feet wide. A blast of hot, acrid air hit Thomas in the face. It smelled of sulfur, burning rubber, and something ancient. He coughed, pulling his shirt up over his nose. He grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the hole. Timber supports, old creosote-soaked timbers, rusted minecart rails disappearing into darkness. A mine shaft. Thomas's mind raced. The deed said agricultural. The survey mentioned shale. There was no mention of mining. But here it was, a tunnel leading north under the ridge, and the heat billowing out was easily over 100 degrees. He stepped closer. 20 feet down the tunnel, lying between the rusted tracks, was a yellow plastic hard hat. Modern, a reflective sticker on the side. Next to it, crushed into the dirt, was a red Starbucks cup. Someone had been down here recently. Thomas gripped the crowbar and made a decision that went against every survival instinct he had. He didn't flee into the blizzard. He went into the fire. He put on his work boots, tied a wet bandana over his nose and mouth, and taped the spare flashlight to his shoulder with duct tape. The tunnel sloped gently downward, heading north under the ridge. The temperature was suffocating, like walking into a furnace. His shirt was soaked through in minutes. 100 feet in the tunnel forked. The main shaft continued down. A side tunnel had been boarded up with fresh plywood. Fresh, stamped with a logo, Billing Supply Company. Date stamp from 2 months ago. Thomas jammed the crowbar behind the plywood and heaved. The wood splintered. He kicked it in and stepped through into a storage room. Cooler here. The flashlight beams swept across plastic totes stacked against the walls. Hundreds of them. In the center of the room, a laptop sat on a folding table connected to car batteries and a solar inverter. Thomas opened the nearest tote. Dirt. Dark, loamy soil. He dug his hand in and felt something hard. Pulled it out. A bone. Femur. Too large to be human. Bison, maybe. He opened another bin. More dirt. Pottery shards. An arrowhead. Fragments of fossilized shell. On the table next to the laptop was a clipboard. Thomas shone his light on the manifest. Item 404, Triceratops frill fragment. Origin Sector 4. Estimated value $22,000. Item 405, Lakota ceremonial pipe circa 1850. Origin Sector 4. Estimated value $8,500. Buyer private collection, New York. Thomas flipped the page. A map, hand-drawn, showing the tunnel system. The storage room was marked as Cache Point Alpha. The main tunnel connected to the old Dutchman mine, abandoned in 1957. And there in red marker, a zone labeled Danger Active Fire. Do not enter. The coal seam fire. Not a rumor, not ancient history. Active. And these people, whoever they were, had been looting the area around it, pulling fossils and artifacts from land they didn't own, using the mine as a hidden highway. A sound echoed from the main tunnel. Voices. Thomas froze. I saw the light. Elias, the old fool, broke through. Just get it done. The storm provides cover. Nobody looks for a frozen body until spring. Thomas recognized the second voice. Richard Webb. He looked around the storage room. One entrance, no other exits. He was trapped. Webb and whoever Elias was, they were coming. They'd seen his flashlight. It was in here. Thomas grabbed the jumper cables from the battery bank and ran to the tunnel entrance. He could see their lights bobbing in the dark, maybe 50 yards away. His mind raced through options. He needed a distraction. He needed time. Mr. Reed! Webb's voice boomed through the tunnel, distorted by the confined space. "You are trespassing on county property." "My property," Thomas shouted back. "I saw the manifest, Webb. I know what you're selling." The light stopped moving. "That's unfortunate, Art." A different voice. Older. Gravelly. "Must be Elias." "Truly." A gunshot cracked. The bullet whined off the stone wall inches from Thomas's head. He ducked back into the storage room, heart trying to punch through his ribs. He looked at the batteries, the jumper cables, the walls of dry timber, and exposed coal dust in the ceiling. He could create a spark. But coal dust was explosive. One wrong move and he'd bring the whole mountain down on top of all of them. His eyes landed on a yellow canister in the corner. MAPP gas, used for welding. He grabbed it, cracked the valve, and threw it into the hallway toward the approaching lights. "What was that gas?" Thomas screamed. "I've cracked a gas line. One shot and we all blow." The footsteps stopped. "He's bluffing. You smell that, Webb?" "That ain't sulfur. That's gas." Thomas stepped into the hallway holding the jumper cables like a switch. "I'm walking out. I'm going to my truck. If you shoot the spark, ignites the gas, we all die right here." Silence stretched. Then Webb's voice soft. "Back up." Thomas counted to 10. He heard boots retreating. He walked up the tunnel, cables raised. When he reached the junction, he saw their flashlights disappearing toward the breach in his wall. They were going back into his shelter. They'd wait for him there, ambush him the moment he climbed through. He stopped, looked at the map he'd stuffed in his pocket. There was another way out. Ventilation shaft B marked as unstable. It came out on the north face of the ridge. Thomas turned and ran deeper toward the fire. The temperature climbed. The walls shimmered with heat. He passed the danger zone, saw the dull red glow of burning coal through a collapsed side passage. It breathed like a living thing, consuming the mountain from the inside. He found shaft B, a vertical ladder bolted into rock leading up into a narrow chimney. He climbed, arms shaking, knees screaming. The rungs were slick with condensation. He climbed for what felt like eternity, flashlight clenched in his teeth. At the top, a metal grate blocked the exit, rusted shut. Thomas pushed. It didn't budge. No, he slammed the crowbar against it. Clang, clang. The wind outside answered. He hooked the crowbar through the grate and leveraged it against the rock. He put all his weight into it. Thought of Margaret. Thought of Emily calling him crazy. Thought of Webb selling history for pocket change. He roared. Snap. The hinges gave. The grate flew open. Thomas shoved his upper body out into the blizzard. The cold hit like a physical blow. -30. Inside the shaft, it had been 110. The temperature shock nearly made him black out. He dragged himself onto the north face. Snow waist deep, wind ferocious. He was alive. But he was on the wrong side of the mountain in a blizzard with no coat. Hypothermia would set in within minutes. He scrambled up the rocks. His clothes began to freeze, shirt turning to a hard shell. He crested the ridge and looked down at his property. The shelter glowed from inside. Two silhouettes stood in his home waiting. Thomas stumbled down the slope. He couldn't feel his fingers. He reached the truck, tried the door, frozen shut. He looked back. Webb was turning, looking out the glass. Webb raised his gun. Thomas smashed the window with the crowbar. Dove inside, jammed the key in the ignition. Chug, chug, click, battery dead. He stared at the dashboard, 50 feet from his warm shelter, about to freeze in his truck while his would-be killers warmed their hands over his compost pile. Then he remembered the backup battery bank in the external shed, right next to the truck, and he had jumper cables under the seat. Thomas rolled out, crawled to the shed, kicked the door open, 4 massive batteries charged by his solar array. He grabbed cables, connected them to the bank, ran back to the truck, clamped them onto the dead terminals. Bang! A bullet shattered the side mirror. Webb stood in the shelter doorway, aiming. "Give it up, Arthur." Thomas jumped into the cab, turned the key. The engine roared. He didn't put it in reverse. He put it in drive. Stomped the gate. The truck lurched forward, plowing through snow. He wasn't driving away. He was driving at them. Webb's eyes went wide. He fired. The windshield spider-webbed. Thomas ducked, aimed straight for the glass wall. The truck smashed into the shower doors. Glass exploded. Timber shattered. The truck's nose punched into the shelter momentum, carrying it 6 feet inside before the front axle caught on the foundation, and the whole thing stopped with a shriek of metal. Thomas sat up, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Webb was pinned against the back wall by the bumper, screaming. Elias, who turned out to be Clark Patterson, dove to the side, scrambling over the compost pile toward the mine shaft. I wouldn't go back in there. Thomas climbed out of the truck, gripping the crowbar. The fire's spreading. Clark froze at the edge of the hole, looked at the darkness, looked at Thomas, slumped against the dirt. The police are on their way. Thomas lied. My daughter called them when I didn't check in. Clark slid down the wall, put his face in his hands. Thomas looked around his ruined shelter. The south wall was gone, snow blowing and cold returning with violent speed. But the thermometer on the back wall, miraculously unbroken, still read 87 degrees. Because the heat from the mine was still pouring out of the breach, unstoppable. He walked to the coffee pot, still sitting on the hot plate powered by the battery bank. Poured a cup, sat on the tailgate of his truck inside his broken cave, and watched snow swirl around the pinned councilman. You were right, Webb. It wasn't up to code. He took a sip and waited for morning. Dawn broke over Blackwood Ridge at 7:43, the sky turning from black to gray to a pale blue that hurt to look at. Thomas hadn't slept. He'd sat on the truck's tailgate for 6 hours watching Webb's labored breathing, listening to Clark sob quietly against the wall, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The thermometer still read 84 degrees despite the gaping hole where the south wall used to be. Heat poured from the mine shaft like an open furnace, steam rising where it met the sub-zero air, creating a surreal fog that hung in the ruined shelter. Webb had stopped screaming around 4 in the morning. The bumper pinned his legs at an angle that made Thomas's own knees ache in sympathy. But sympathy was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every 20 minutes, Thomas had checked Webb's pulse, made sure he was still conscious. Not out of mercy, out of necessity. Dead men couldn't testify. Your spine's intact. Thomas's voice was hoarse from breathing smoke and cold air. I can tell by the way you're moving your toes. You're going to live. Webb's response was a string of words Thomas ignored. Clark had gone silent an hour ago, staring at the mine shaft opening with the hollow eyes of a man calculating his remaining life in single digits. The sound of a helicopter changed everything. Thomas stood every joint, protesting, and walked to where the south wall used to be. The chopper came in low over the ridge, a yellow bell, with state police stenciled on the side. It circled twice downdraft, sending snow devils spinning across the clearing, then landed 50 yards away near where Thomas's Airstream had been. The trailer was now just a white mound buried. 3 people climbed out. 2 state troopers in heavy gear, and a woman in a Navy parka with BLM patches on the shoulders. The troopers reached Thomas, first hands on their weapons, reading the scene. Crashed truck, broken glass, 2 men, one clearly injured. Blood on Thomas's face from the cut that had scabbed over during the night. Sir, step away from the vehicle. Thomas raised his hand, still holding the empty coffee cup. He's pinned, needs medical attention. That one tried to shoot me. The trooper's eyes flicked to Clark, to Webb, back to Thomas. Anyone else here? Just us 3. And about $1 million in stolen fossils in the mine shaft. The BLM agent stepped forward. She was younger than Thomas expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes that took in details faster than seemed possible. Agent Ross, I got your email at 3:47 this morning. The photos, the manifests, the video clips. She looked at the mine shaft, at the heat shimmer rising from it. I brought friends. 2 more helicopters appeared over the ridge. Federal. The cavalry had arrived. The next 4 hours were chaos, orchestrated by people who did this for a living. Paramedics stabilized Webb, got him onto a stretcher, loaded him into the first chopper out. He was screaming again by then, demanding his lawyer, demanding Thomas be arrested for assault. The trooper taking notes just kept writing. Clark went quieter. He answered every question in a monotone, staring at his hands. When they asked him if he wanted a lawyer, he said he wanted to tell them everything. About the looting operation, about Webb's connections to auction houses in New York and Boston, about the 18 months they've been pulling artifacts and fossils from the federal land surrounding the old Blackwood mine, about how they'd accidentally cracked the seal on the coal seam fire last March with explosive charges meant to widen a tunnel, and about how Webb had panicked when Thomas bought the land, knowing that any serious excavation would expose their operation. Agent Ross recorded it all on a device smaller than a pack of cards. When Clark mentioned the fire, her expression shifted. How bad? Clark looked at the mine shaft. Bad enough that we stopped going past the junction 6 weeks ago. Temperature at the active face was hitting 130, 140. We figured we had maybe 3 months before the whole system collapsed. Ross turned to Thomas. You've been living on top of an active mine fire for 3 weeks. I've been living on top of a geothermal battery. Thomas sat on a rock, exhausted beyond measure. The fire just made it more efficient than I calculated. She almost smiled. That's one way to look at it. They wanted Thomas to fly out with the next medevac. Hypothermia screening, carbon monoxide exposure, the usual protocols. He refused until Ross agreed to let him walk through the mine with her team, show them the cache room, help them understand the scope. She agreed on the condition that he wore a respirator and stayed with a safety officer at all times. The walk down took 15 minutes. The federal team had brought lights, real ones, and the tunnel looked different under white LED illumination. Less hellish, just old and dangerous and filled with evidence of human greed. They photographed everything. The totes, the laptop, the manifest, the map with sector designations that matched BLM survey coordinates for protected archaeological sites. In the cache room, Ross opened tote after tote, her face getting harder with each one. A Blackfoot war shirt, pottery from the Clovis period, a nearly complete Edmontosaurus skull. Each item represented history stolen, context destroyed, knowledge lost. This is a federal case now, her voice echoed off stone. Antiquities Act violations, Archaeological Resources Protection Act, theft from federal land. And if we can prove the fire was started by their excavation, we're adding environmental crimes. What happens to my land? Ross looked at him. She had the expression of someone about to deliver news she'd delivered before. Mr. Reed, we're going to have to seal this entire area. The fire is spreading. Our geologists say you've got maybe 6 months before the integrity of the whole ridge is compromised. This becomes a hazmat zone. Eminent domain. We'll compensate you for the purchase price, but I lose everything. I'm sorry. They flew him to Missoula General at noon. Thomas sat in the helicopter, watching his property shrink to a patch of white marked by tiny figures moving around his broken shelter. From the air, he could see the heat signature. Infrared cameras showed the coal seam fire as a red snake coiling under the ridge, branching out, growing. The pilot who'd seen mine fires before shook his head. Another year and that would have surfaced. Whole ridge would have looked like a volcano. At the hospital, they ran tests. Core temperature had recovered. Carbon monoxide levels were elevated, but not critical. The burns on his hands were second-degree treatable with ointment in time. The doctor, a tired woman with gray streaks in her black hair, sat on the edge of his bed. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Reed. Another hour in that temperature gradient, and your heart would have stopped. I didn't feel lucky. You should. She handed him a cup of water. Your daughter's in the waiting room. She's been here since 6 this morning. Thomas froze. How did she know? The doctor's expression softened. She called the state police every hour, starting at midnight. She had your location from your phone's GPS. When they told her about the helicopters, she drove from Seattle. 11 hours straight. Thomas closed his eyes. The water cup shook in his hand. They let Emily in after the doctor left. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and Thomas saw what 3 months of separation had done. She looked thinner, older. Her eyes were red from crying, or not sleeping, or both. She crossed the room in 4 steps and hugged him, careful of the IV line, careful of the bandages on his hands. You smell like smoke. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. I've been living in a cave, I know. I've been reading about it. The news is everywhere, Dad. You found a fossil theft ring. You exposed a corrupt councilman. You survived a mine fire. She pulled back, looked at his face. You could have died. I didn't, but you could have. She sat in the chair beside the bed, took his unbandaged hand. When they told me the state police were at your property, when they said there'd been an incident, I thought. She stopped. Couldn't finish. Thomas squeezed her hand. I'm sorry. For all of it. For not listening when you tried to help. For cutting you off. For being so stubborn, I drove a truck into my own house rather than admit I was wrong. You weren't wrong about the engineering. Emily's laugh was wet with tears. The thermal flywheel works. Everyone's talking about it. There are engineers analyzing your design from the photos. They're saying it would have maintained 65 degrees even without the mine fire. 68, Thomas corrected. I did the math again last night while I waited for the police. The thermal mass calculations were conservative. With proper sealing, it would have hit 70. Emily shook her head, but she was smiling, still lecturing. Even now, it's who I am, I know. And I'm sorry I tried to change that. After Mom died, when you showed me the plans, I thought you were running away from grief. But you weren't running, you were building something. You just picked terrible ground. The ground was fine, it was the neighbors. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, snow had started falling again, soft flakes that stuck to the window. Thomas watched them accumulate and thought about thermal transfer, about how snow was actually an excellent insulator if you had enough of it, how the Inuit had understood thermal dynamics centuries before Europeans wrote the equations. What happens now? Emily's question pulled him back. Federal government condemns the land. I get $85,000 for the purchase price, maybe 20 more for documented construction costs. Then I have nothing. No house, no guam, no retirement, no project. You have me. Thomas looked at his daughter. She'd inherited Margaret's eyes, the same gray blue that could see through his defenses. I can't ask you to take care of me. You're not asking. I'm offering. She leaned forward. I have a house in Missoula with a guest room, 800 square feet, and a backyard with southern exposure. We checked the zoning. Accessory dwelling units are legal. Thomas felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen since May. You want me to build another one? I want you to build it right this time. With permits, with help, with your daughter who's apparently going to spend the rest of her life worrying about you freezing to death. I wasn't freezing. I was at 96 degrees, Dad. All right, he closed his eyes. All right, the news broke that evening. Thomas watched it from his hospital bed, Emily sitting beside him with her laptop open. The local Montana stations picked it up first. State and federal agents raid fossil theft ring near Blackwood Ridge. Then the networks. Engineers thermal shelter uncovers million-dollar smuggling operation. By midnight, it was trending on social media. The video changed everything. Someone from the BLM team had leaked the GoPro footage Thomas had taken in the mine. The walk through the tunnel, the cache room, the manifest, the heat shimmer from the burning coal seam, 2 million views in 6 hours. The comments section was chaos. Half the people calling Thomas a hero, the other half analyzing his thermal engineering, arguing about R values and insulation coefficients, and whether passive solar could really maintain livable temperatures in a Montana winter. A user called thermalphysicist_PhD posted a detailed breakdown. I ran the numbers, removed the geothermal anomaly from the mine fire. His design with proper glazing and full thermal mass would maintain 64 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit through a Montana winter. That's revolutionary. That's free heat using nothing but physics and the sun. Another user replied, where are the blueprints? Can we see the calculations? The thread exploded. Hundreds of people asking the same question. How did he do it? Show us the math. We want to build this. Emily refreshed the page and turned the laptop toward Thomas. Look at this. Thomas read the comments. The requests, the interest. People from Alaska, from Minnesota, from Maine, all asking how to build what he'd built, how to escape the utility companies, how to heat their homes with sunshine and stone. Dad, this is bigger than Montana. Emily's voice was quiet. This is bigger than one shelter. It's just thermodynamics. It's hope. She scrolled through more comments. These are people who can't afford heating bills. People who want to live off grid. People who think you found a solution. I didn't find anything. I just read textbooks nobody else bothers with anymore. Then maybe you should teach them. The next morning, Jake Morrison showed up at the hospital with Dale Kramer. They'd driven together from Blackwood County, brought Thomas's personal effects from the shelter before the BLM sealed it. His laptop, his notebooks, the urn with Margaret's ashes that he'd kept on the shelf carved into the stone wall. Jake set the urn on the bedside table carefully. Figured you'd want this. Thomas picked it up. The ceramic was cold. Thank you. Dale stood near the door looking uncomfortable. I owe you an apology, Mr. Reed. I knew something was wrong with that land. I should have told you straight up instead of running. You had family to think about. I understand. Dale shook his head. That's not an excuse. I was scared Clark would blacklist me from work in the county. But what you did going into that mine, standing up to Webb that took real stones. He stuck out his hand. If you ever build another one of these shelters, I want in. Thomas shook his hand. Deal. Jake pulled up a chair. I've been getting calls. People saw the video. They want to know if I can build them thermal shelters. I told them I don't have the expertise yet, but if you'd be willing to teach me the engineering, I'd split the fees. Thomas looked at Emily. She was watching him with an expression he recognized. It was the same look Margaret used to give him when she knew he was about to say yes to something that would consume him. I need to build one more first. Prove the concept without a mine fire underneath. Then we'll talk. Jake grinned. I'll hold you to that. After they left, Emily opened her laptop again. She'd been quiet all morning working on something. Now she turned the screen toward Thomas. I did something. I hope you're not mad. It was a GoFundMe page. Help Thomas Reed build Geothermal Shelter 2.0. There was a photo of the ruined shelter taken from the BLM footage, a description of the project, the engineering principles, the setback, the plan to rebuild in Missoula. The goal was $30,000. The current total was $51,340. Posted 8 hours ago. Emily watched his face. Jake helped me write it. We wanted to wait until you were stable to show you. Thomas stared at the number, 51,000, from strangers, from people who believed in what he was trying to do. 2,847 individual donors. I don't know what to say. Say you'll use it. Say you'll build something that proves the physics works. Say you'll share the knowledge so other people can do the same. Thomas scrolled through the donor comments. A woman from Fairbanks. My heating bill is $400 a month. Please share how you did this. A man from Wisconsin. Lost my job, can't afford propane. This could save my family. A college student studying mechanical engineering because of people like you. He looked at his daughter. When can we start? The discharge papers came through 3 days later. Thomas left the hospital with second-degree burns that were healing, a prescription for antibiotics, and strict instructions to avoid extreme temperatures for at least 2 weeks. Emily drove him to her house in Missoula, a modest 2-story with cedar siding and a view of the mountains. The guest room was on the first floor, south-facing, with a window that caught the afternoon light. That night, Thomas spread his notebooks across the kitchen table while Emily cooked dinner. He started sketching. Not the shelter he'd lost, but the shelter he should have built. Smaller footprint, better insulation, custom glazing instead of shower doors, earth berms instead of deep excavation, and this time proper geological surveys before breaking ground. Emily set a plate in front of him, chicken stir-fry, steam rising. You're already working, just planning. She sat across from him, studying the sketches. How long will it take? 6 months to design properly. 4 more to build. If we start in April, we could be testing by October. She emphasized the word. I'll need help. I can't do it alone anymore. Good, because I'm not letting you try. They ate in comfortable silence. Outside, snow fell steadily, blanketing Missoula in white. Thomas thought about Margaret, about the summer that never ended. He thought about the ridge he'd lost and the structure he'd destroyed, trying to save it. He thought about Webb in a hospital bed with pins in his legs, and Clark in a county jail cell waiting for federal charges. He thought about the coal seams still burning 400 feet below the surface, patient and inevitable. And he thought about the $51,000 from people who wanted to believe that heat didn't have to cost money that winter. Didn't have to mean submission to utility companies, that an old engineer with bleeding hands and ash in his truck could show them a different way. The math was sound. The physics was settled. All he had to do was prove it. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas recovered and planned. Emily went back to work at her law firm, but came home every evening to find new sketches, new calculations, new refinements. He wasn't building a shelter anymore. He was designing a system, modular, replicable, something people could adapt to their own climates and budgets. The specifications emerged slowly. Foundation depth 8 feet, hitting stable ground temperature without reaching the permafrost line. South wall custom argon-filled, triple pane glass, R value of 8.3, angled at 47 degrees from Missoula's latitude. Thermal mass, 65 tons, combination of concrete slab and stacked river rock. Air circulation, solar-powered fan system that pushed hot air into earth tubes during the day, pulled stored heat back at night. And a backup biomass system fully isolated from the living space in case the passive solar wasn't enough. The BLM sent their final report in late December. The Blackwood Ridge coal seam fire was confirmed active and spreading. Estimated time until surface breakthrough, 14 to 18 months. The entire 40 acres was condemned as a hazmat zone. Thomas received a check for $105,000, 85 for the land, 20 for documented construction costs. It wasn't enough to replace what he'd lost, but it was enough to start again. Agent Ross called him personally to deliver the rest. Webb and Clark are both talking. Webb's lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea, but we've got them on 18 federal counts. The fossils alone represent about $1.2 million in black market value. The cultural artifacts, the Native American items, those carry mandatory minimums. What about restitution? The items are being returned to their proper context: museums, tribal councils, research institutions. Your footage helped us track down buyers in 4 states. Some of it we might never recover, but you stopped them before they could strip the site clean. Thomas thought about the Triceratops frill fragment, about the Lakota pipe, about history that belonged to everyone, stolen by men who saw only dollar signs. I'm glad it helped. You did more than help, Mr. Reed. You exposed a systematic looting operation that's been running for years. The only reason they got away with it so long was because they knew the territory. They knew where to dig. They knew how to move product without anyone seeing. Your shelter was bad luck for them or good luck for us. After the call, Thomas sat in the guest room and looked at the urn on the dresser. He'd been carrying Margaret's ashes for 8 months, unable to decide where she belonged. Not Seattle, where they'd lived, but never felt at home. Not Montana, where she'd never wanted to be in the first place. He picked up the urn and walked to the kitchen. Emily was making tea, her back to him. I think I'm ready. Ready for what? To let her go. Emily turned, saw the urn, her eyes filled. Where I was thinking your backyard. In the spring when things start growing, she'd like that, being part of something green. Emily set down the kettle and hugged him. Mom would love that. January brought sub-zero temperatures and a routine. Thomas woke early, sketched until Emily left for work, then spent the day refining designs. Jake drove up from Blackwood County every weekend, learning the engineering, asking questions that made Thomas think harder about thermal transfer coefficients and heat retention curves. Dale came twice, bringing news from the county. Webb had taken a plea deal, 4 years federal prison. Clark, who'd cooperated fully, got 3 years and a $200,000 fine. The video kept spreading. By mid-January, it had hit 4 million views. Engineering forums dissected every frame. A professor at Montana State University reached out, wanted to use Thomas's shelter as a case study in his sustainable design course. A documentary crew from Denver asked permission to film the construction of Mark II. But the most meaningful contact came from a stranger in Alaska, a man named Robert Hutchins, who lived off-grid north of Fairbanks. He'd seen the video, run the calculations for his latitude, and built a smaller version. 400 square feet, 6 tons of thermal mass, glazing angled at 64 degrees. He sent photos of his first winter test. Outside temperature, -38 Fahrenheit. Inside temperature, 69 Fahrenheit. Heating input 0. Thomas stared at the email for 10 minutes. Someone had built it. Someone had proven the concept in conditions even harsher than Montana. The physics worked. It wasn't just his obsession anymore. It was real. He forwarded the email to Emily with one line, "This is what we're building." Her response came back 5 minutes later. "When do we start?" February turned into March. The snow began to melt. Thomas and Emily walked the backyard, measuring the southern exposure, checking the slope, planning the excavation. They hired a geological surveyor, a cautious woman who spent 2 days drilling core samples and running sonar tests. No mines, no coal seams, bedrock stable at 9 feet. Perfect. The permit process took 3 weeks. This time Thomas did it right. Complete architectural drawings, engineering calculations verified by a licensed PE, environmental impact assessment. The Planning Commission approved it unanimously. One councilwoman, an older woman with reading glasses on a chain, shook his hand after the vote. "I saw the video. Mr. Reed, I'm glad you're building another one." By April, they were ready to break ground. Jake took a week off from his new job to help. Dale drove up with his excavator. Emily took vacation days. And on April 15th, under a clear blue sky that promised spring, They dug the first shovelful of earth. This time Thomas knew what lay beneath. This time there were no secrets waiting in the dark. The excavation took 2 weeks. Controlled, methodical, supervised by the geological consultant who checked every layer as they descended. At 8 feet they hit bedrock. Solid granite, no fissures, no anomalies. Dale poured the foundation forms himself, mixing the concrete with fly ash just as Thomas specified. The slab went down in one continuous pour 10 inches thick with embedded PEX tubing that would eventually circulate heat through the floor. While the concrete cured, Thomas and Jake built the frame. Lodgepole pine again, but this time properly kiln-dried and treated. The south wall framing went up at 47 degrees, checked 3 times with a digital level accurate to 0.1 degrees. Emily worked alongside them, learning to use a chop saw drilling pilot holes, her hands developing calluses that matched the ones Thomas had earned. The custom glazing arrived in May. Not shower doors this time, but engineered panels from a company in Colorado that specialized in passive solar construction. Each panel was 3 layers of low iron glass with argon gas between them. R value of 8.3. The company rep who delivered them personally wanted to watch the installation. "We've never done a project at this latitude with this angle. I want to see how you handle the ceiling." Thomas showed him. Marine-grade silicone applied in continuous beads with no gaps, compression gaskets at every joint. Flashing that would shed snow and rain away from the seams. The rep took photos, made notes. "If this works, we're going to recommend your design to other clients." "It'll work," Jake said, tightening the last bolt. The back wall was Thomas's favorite part. He and Emily drove to the Clark Fork River and spent 2 days selecting stones. Smooth river rocks, each one chosen for size and thermal density. They stacked them by hand, mortaring them with the same care medieval masons had used on cathedrals. 65 tons of thermal mass arranged in curves that would radiate heat evenly through the space. By June, the shell was complete. Thomas stood inside, looking up at the timber ceiling, feeling the cool air that would soon be warm. Emily stood beside him, arms crossed, surveying their work. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It's functional. It can be both, Dad." The earth berm went on in July. They hired a landscaping crew with a small dozer to pile soil against the northeast and west walls. 3 feet thick, sloping away from the structure for drainage. On top of the berm, they planted native grasses and wildflowers. By August, the shelter looked like it was growing out of the hillside, a natural part of the landscape. The final system, the active component, took the most time to perfect. Thomas designed a network of 6-inch PVC pipes buried in trenches radiating out from the shelter. During the day, a small solar-powered fan would push hot air from the greenhouse space into these earth tubes, warming the surrounding soil. At night, the fan would reverse, pulling that stored heat back into the living space. A battery, but made of dirt instead of chemicals. They tested it in late August on a day when the temperature hit 90 degrees outside. Thomas closed the door, activated the fan, and watched. Within an hour, the interior temperature dropped to 71 degrees. The earth tubes were working, pulling heat out, storing it underground. That night, when the temperature fell to 55, he reversed the fan. The heat came back, 70 degrees by midnight, stable through dawn. Emily found him at 6 in the morning, still sitting in the shelter, still watching the thermometer. "Did you sleep at all?" "Couldn't," he pointed at the gauge. "It works, Em. No mine fire, no geothermal anomaly, just physics." She sat beside him on the bench they'd built into the south wall. "So what's next?" "Next we wait for winter. Real winter. -20, -30. That's the test. And if it passes, then we publish everything. Full blueprints, materials list, construction guide, Creative Commons license. Anyone who wants to build one can build one." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "Mom would be proud of you." Thomas looked at the urn they'd brought out here, placed on a shell carved into the river rock wall. In 2 weeks, when the wildflowers bloomed, they'd scatter the ashes. Let Margaret become part of the earth that would keep people warm. She'd say, "I was crazy." She'd say, "You were stubborn." But yeah, she'd be proud. September brought cooler nights. The passive solar started to show its potential. Morning sun hit the glass, heated the concrete slab, warmed the river rock wall. By noon, interior temperature was 75 degrees. At night, the stored heat radiated back. 68 degrees through the dark hours. The thermodynamics were working exactly as calculated. October brought the first frost. Overnight low of 28 degrees. Thomas slept in the shelter wrapped in a blanket monitoring. Dawn temperature, 66 degrees. Heating input 0 kilowatts. November brought snow, 3 inches overnight, then 6, then a foot. The earth berm insulated perfectly. The south-facing glass shed snow, naturally the angle Thomas had calculated preventing buildup. Inside, the temperature held steady, 68 to 72 degrees, oscillating gently with the sun's rhythm. And then came the real test. November 18th, a cold front swept down from Canada. The temperature in Missoula plummeted. By midnight, it was -5 degrees Fahrenheit. By 3 in the morning, -15. By dawn, -23. Thomas woke in the shelter, breath visible in the LED lantern light. He looked at the thermometer mounted on the wall, the same analog gauge that had survived the destruction of Mark I. The needle rested steady at 71 degrees. He got out of bed, walked to the glass wall, pressed his hand against it. Cold on the outside, but inside the air was warm. The concrete radiated gentle heat into his bare feet. The river rocks along the back wall felt like sun-warmed stone in summer. He'd done it. He'd built a summer that never ended, and this time nobody could take it away. Emily found him there an hour later, still standing at the glass, watching the thermometer like it might suddenly change its mind. She'd brought coffee in a thermos and 2 mugs. The house is freezing. Furnace is working overtime. How is it in here 71 degrees? She poured coffee, handed him a mug. You're crying. Thomas touched his face. He hadn't realized. Just tired. You're allowed to be happy, Dad. You earned this. I wish she could see it. Emily looked at the urn. She does, in the only way that matters now. They scattered Margaret's ashes in December when the wildflowers were long gone, but the earth was soft enough to receive them. Thomas and Emily walked the perimeter of the shelter, letting the ash drift into the berm, into the soil that would hold warmth through winter, that would feed roots in spring. Margaret Reed, Emily said quietly, 1961 to 2024. She hated being cold, but she loved summer, Thomas added, so we gave her one that lasts forever. The YouTube video went live on December 22nd, the winter solstice. Emily had helped him film it, asking questions, keeping him focused. The production was simple. Thomas standing in Mark II thermometer visible in the background. Outside, temperature displayed -20 degrees. Inside, temperature 72 degrees. He explained the principles. Thermal mass, solar gain, insulation, earth coupling. Every decision, every calculation. He walked through the shelter, showing the construction details. The glazing, the air tubes, the river rock wall, the concrete slab with its embedded heating pipes that would never carry hot water because they'd never need to. At the end, he looked directly at the camera. People ask me why I'm sharing this for free. Why not patent it, sell plans, make money? The answer is simple. Physics doesn't send a bill. The sun doesn't charge rent. And if I can help people stay warm without burning their savings or the planet, that's worth more than any patent. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Last year, I lost my wife. I lost my job. I lost my home. I thought building this shelter would give me something to live for. But it gave me something better. It gave me a way to help people I'll never meet in places I'll never see survive winters that would otherwise break them. Another pause. The blueprints are available now. Complete plans, materials lists, construction guides, Creative Commons license. Build it, improve it, share what you learn. Let's make winter optional. Emily stopped recording. She lowered the camera. That was perfect. It was honest. Same thing, Dad. The video hit 100,000 views in 12 hours. By the end of the week, it had gone viral. 1 million views, 2 million, 5. Engineering subreddits exploded with discussion. Sustainable building forums crashed from traffic. The comments section became a knowledge base. People sharing modifications, asking technical questions, posting their own build plans. Downloads of the blueprints hit 10,000 in the first week. By January, it was 50,000. By February, 183,000. People were building Thomas Reed thermal shelters in Montana, Wyoming, Alaska, Wisconsin, Maine. Modifications for different climates, different budgets, different skill levels. A man in Minnesota built one for $8,000 using recycled materials. A woman in Idaho built one as a greenhouse and living space combined. A retired couple in Vermont built one as their primary residence and hadn't turned on their furnace in 3 months. The Facebook group formed organically. Thermal Flywheel Builders. 12,000 members in 2 months. People posting photos, sharing data, comparing performance metrics. Thomas joined reluctantly at Emily's insistence. He answered questions when he could, corrected misconceptions about thermal transfer, helped people troubleshoot designs. But mostly he watched. Watched people take his idea and make it better. Watched them solve problems he hadn't considered. Watched them build communities around the simple idea that warmth was a right, not a commodity. In March, Dale called. "I've got 6 people who want me to build these. Can you send me the updated plans? Already done. Check your email, Tom. I'm 62 years old. I thought I'd finish my career fixing tractors. Now I'm building the future. You're building shelters, same as we did in the Blackwood mine. Yeah, but these ones won't try to kill us." Jake called 2 days later with similar news. Morrison Geothermal Construction was now a registered LLC. He'd hired 2 employees. Had contracts lined up through November. "Business is good, Tom, really good. Just remember the license terms. No markup over materials and labor costs. This isn't about profit, understood. But labor's worth something. These builds are skilled work. Fair enough? And Tom, thanks for teaching me, for trusting me, for building something that matters. Thank you for helping me dig the first hole." The recognition came from unexpected places. Montana State offered Thomas an adjunct position teaching passive solar design. He declined. A TED conference invited him to speak. He declined that too. But when a community college in Billings asked him to do a single workshop for students who couldn't afford university, he said yes. 50 people showed up. Students, retirees, young families, all wanting to learn. Thomas talked for 3 hours, showing calculations, explaining physics, answering every question. At the end, a young woman raised her hand. "I'm a single mom. I can't afford heating bills. Can I build one of these for $5,000? Thomas thought about it. If you have labor, if you can scavenge materials, if you're willing to start small and expand later, yes. You can build a 400 square foot version for $5,000, maybe less. The woman wrote it down like scripture. By summer, Thomas had fallen into a rhythm. Mornings in the shelter working on refinements to the design. Afternoons helping Emily in the garden, letting the sun warm his shoulders while they grew vegetables in the enriched soil above Margaret's ashes. Evenings answering emails from builders solving problems, learning from their innovations. He was 63 years old, no job, no retirement fund, living in his daughter's guest house. And for the first time since Margaret died, he wasn't building to fill a void. He was building because people needed it, because winter was optional, because physics didn't send a bill. One evening in late July, Emily found him in the shelter laptop open working on Mark III, a theoretical design for extreme northern latitudes, glazing angled at 65 degrees, thermal mass increased to 90 tons. Planning your next project. She sat beside him, just thinking. There are people in Fairbanks and Yellowknife places where winter is 6 months long and heating costs can run $800–900 a month. They need this more than anyone. So build it. I'm too old to move to Alaska, then teach someone who isn't. She gestured at the laptop. That's what this whole thing is about, right? Not you building every shelter, everyone building them. Thomas looked at the screen at the calculations that had consumed the last 3 hours. You're right, I usually am. Emily stood stretched. Come inside. It's taco night. In a minute. Dad, the shelter will still be here in the morning. He saved the file, closed the laptop, looked around at the space they'd built together. Concrete floor, river rock walls, glass that caught the setting sun and turned everything golden. A shelter that had kept them at 71 degrees through negative 23-degree weather. A shelter that proved physics could triumph over winter. A shelter that was already being replicated 418 times across North America. Margaret would have hated it, he said suddenly. Too small, too dark. No central heating. Emily paused at the door, but she would have loved what it became. What's that hope? She smiled. Come on, tacos are getting cold. Thomas stood, joints protesting less than they had a year ago. Turned off the lantern, walked toward his daughter, toward dinner, toward a future that looked nothing like what he'd planned, but everything like what he needed. Behind him, the thermometer read 72 degrees. Outside, the Montana summer evening was cooling toward 50. Inside the shelter, physics kept its promise. The following December arrived with the kind of cold that made weathermen run out of adjectives. The forecast called for the coldest week in Missoula's recorded history. A high-pressure system stalled over Montana, trapping Arctic air that had spent weeks building strength over the Yukon. Schools closed preemptively. The governor declared a state of emergency. Utility companies warned of rolling blackouts as demand spiked beyond capacity. Thomas sat in Mark II on December 5th, watching frost patterns form on the outside of the triple-pane glass. The temperature had dropped to -8 overnight. His phone showed alerts from the National Weather Service. Wind chill advisory, extreme cold warning, expected low -35 Fahrenheit. Emily knocked, then entered without waiting. Her breath formed clouds in the space between the main house and the shelter, a distance of maybe 30 feet. The house furnace has been running non-stop since yesterday. Our gas bill is going to be insane. How's it in here? Thomas gestured at the thermometer. 70 degrees, dropped 2 degrees overnight. 2 degrees. Emily walked to the glass wall, pressed her palm against the interior surface. It was cool to the touch, but not cold. The outside pane was rimmed with ice. That's it. That's all you lost. The thermal mass is still releasing yesterday's solar gain. We'll see what happens tonight. If it goes below 65, I'll know the insulation needs work. And if it doesn't, then we've proven something that nobody thought was possible. The temperature fell throughout the day. By noon, it was -12. By 3 in the afternoon, -18. The sun was a pale disk behind high clouds offering minimal heat. Thomas logged every reading. Solar gain through glazing minimal. Thermal mass temperature 102 degrees Fahrenheit at the core, measured with a probe heat installed in the river rock wall. Ambient air 68 degrees. The shelter was holding. Not just holding, thriving. Jake called at 4. Tom, people are freaking out. Half of Blackwood County lost power. There's a shelter open at the high school. My wife took the baby there because our heat went out. Is she okay? Yeah, but scared. The shelter's packed. Generators running, but they don't know how long the fuel will last. Jake's voice cracked. I keep thinking if I'd built one of these for my family instead of taking other people's contracts. You had to learn first. And now you know, next year you build one for your family. This year you keep them safe however you can. After the call, Thomas sat in the silence listening to the wind scream outside. The shelter was so well insulated that the storm sounded distant, theoretical, like watching a disaster movie with the sound turned down. He thought about Jake's wife and infant daughter in a high school gymnasium with 200 other people sharing body heat under emergency blankets. He thought about the elderly couple 3 houses down who'd knocked on Emily's door that morning, asking if they could sit in her living room because their heat had failed. He thought about everyone who couldn't afford utility bills, who chose between heating and eating, who watched thermostats like stock tickers determining their survival. The physics worked. The shelter proved it. But proving it in his daughter's backyard while others froze wasn't enough. By sunset, the temperature had reached -27. The wind chill calculator on Thomas's phone showed -48. Exposure kills in under 10 minutes at those temperatures. Frostbite in less than 5. The human body wasn't designed for this kind of cold. But thermal mass didn't care about wind chill. Stone and concrete operated on different timescales. They'd absorbed heat all through autumn, storing it in molecular bonds, in the vibration of atoms, too small to see, but large enough to matter. Now they released it slowly, patient as geology. Emily brought dinner, soup and a thermos bread wrapped in foil to keep it warm. She'd walked from the house wearing a parka, rated to -40, face covered except for her eyes. She stepped into the shelter and pulled down the scarf. Jesus, Dad, it's like summer in here. 67 degrees, down 3 from this morning. The house is 58, and we've got the furnace maxed. She poured soup into 2 mugs. I checked the utility company website. Average Missoula household is using 200 therms of gas per day right now. At current rates, that's about $60. Just for today, this shelter is using 0. I know. She handed him a mug. That's why I've been getting emails all day. People saw your video. They're asking if it's too late to build one, if they can hire Jake. If there's an emergency version that could be done in a week. Thomas sipped the soup. Too hot, but he welcomed the burn. There's no emergency version. This takes time. Planning, proper materials. Then what do we tell them? We tell them the truth. Physics doesn't work on human timescales. But it does work. And next winter, they can be warm. The coldest night came on December 7th. The temperature bottomed out at negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit at 4:17 in the morning. Thomas was awake to see it had been awake since midnight monitoring. He'd placed thermometers at different heights in the shelter. Floor level 69 degrees, waist height 68 degrees, ceiling 67 degrees. The stratification was minimal, almost non-existent. The air was mixing naturally convection, doing its ancient dance. Outside, the world was hostile to life. The stars were sharp as broken glass. The snow had stopped falling because it was too cold for precipitation. The air itself seemed brittle, ready to shatter. Inside Mark II, Thomas sat in his thermal underwear and a t-shirt, sweating slightly. The shelter held at 66 degrees through the coldest hour. No furnace, no space heater, no fire. Just stone and glass and the memory of sunshine from 3 days ago, parceled out in measured doses by the laws of thermodynamics. When dawn broke at 7:42, Thomas was still awake. He documented everything. Temperature logs, humidity readings, air quality measurements. The data was pristine, irrefutable. He'd survived negative 38 degrees in a structure heated by nothing but yesterday's weather. Emily found him at 8, still sitting at the small desk he'd built into the east wall. She'd brought coffee and her laptop. "You didn't sleep." "Couldn't. Too busy watching the impossible happen." "It's not impossible. You calculated it. Calculating and experiencing are different things." He took the coffee gratefully. "All night I kept thinking about the textbooks, the engineering courses, the professors who said passive solar was a boutique solution only viable in warm climates. They were wrong, and now we have proof." Emily opened her laptop. "You have more than proof." She turned the screen toward him. The GoFundMe had been closed months ago, the money dispersed. But the project page remained active, and people had been leaving comments. Hundreds of them overnight. User Sarah M. Alaska built one based on your plans. Fairbanks just hit -42. My shelter is at 69 degrees. You saved my life. User Martinez family _Idaho. This isn't just engineering, this is hope. Our heating bill was $600 per month. Now it's $0. We're using that money for our daughter's college fund. Thomas read them slowly, each one a small weight added to something he couldn't name. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something closer to absolution. "You did it, Dad." Emily's voice was soft. "You built something that matters. We built it. You and me and Jake and Dale. And now 437 other people across America have built it too. 437 that we know of. Could be more." The temperature climbed throughout the day as the sun returned thin and pale but present. By noon, Mark II was back at 70 degrees. The thermal mass had weathered the assault, had given up only a fraction of its stored energy. Thomas calculated that the shelter could survive another week of similar cold before dropping below 60 degrees. And by then, the sun would replenish the battery. The cycle was self-sustaining, infinite as long as the sun rose. That afternoon, the power came back on in Blackwood County. Jake called with the news. "Everyone's okay. Baby's fine. Wife's exhausted, but fine. The high school shelter is closing." He paused. "Tom, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "I want to build one of these for every household in Blackwood County that can't afford heat. Maybe 50 families. I'll do it at cost, just materials and minimum labor. But I need to know if the design scales. Can we do assembly line construction prefab components? Something faster than 4 months per unit." Thomas thought about it. "You'd need to standardize dimensions, create templates for the framing, pre-cut the glazing, precast the concrete slabs." He warmed to the problem mind, already racing through logistics. "You could probably get construction time down to 6 weeks per unit if you had 3 crews working in parallel. So it's possible. It's possible. But Jake, that's a huge undertaking. 50 shelters at $8,000 each is $400,000. I've got investors interested, people who saw the video. They want to fund it as a nonprofit. Thermal Homes Initiative." Jake's voice picked up energy. "We bring free geothermal shelters to low-income families. You consult on design. Dale manages construction. I run the operation. What do you think? I think you're going to need more than 3 crews, so that's a yes." Thomas looked around. Mark II at the shelter that had started as grief and desperation and somehow transformed into something larger than himself. "That's a yes." The documentary crew arrived in January. Three people from a nonprofit journalism outfit in Seattle, the kind that made hour-long pieces for PBS about overlooked innovations. They'd been emailing Emily for weeks, and she'd finally convinced Thomas to say yes. The director was a woman in her 40s named Patricia Walsh. She set up cameras in Mark II outside the shelter in Emily's living room. Asked questions that got at things Thomas hadn't thought about in months. Why this project? Why now? What it meant beyond the engineering. Thomas found himself talking about Margaret, about the summer that never ended, about how grief could be transmuted into warmth if you understood the principles of thermodynamics and didn't mind digging. Patricia listened without interrupting camera running. At the end of 3 hours, she turned it off and sat back. That's the story, not the shelter. You. The shelter is the story. I'm just the engineer. The shelter is a solution. But you're the reason people care about solutions, because you show them it's possible. An old engineer who lost everything builds something that lets people keep what matters most. Warmth, safety, hope. I'm not old. I'm 63. Emily laughed from the doorway. Dad, you're old. Own it. The footage would take months to edit. Patricia said the piece would air next fall, time for when people started thinking about winter again. Thomas didn't care about airtime or audiences. He cared about the temperature readings she'd captured on camera. Exterior -15, interior 71, heating input 0. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers couldn't be argued with. Numbers were the language of truth. By February, the Thermal Homes Initiative had broken ground on its first 5 shelters in Blackwood County. Dale supervised construction, teaching crews the techniques Thomas had developed. Jake managed logistics, working 16-hour days to coordinate materials, schedules, inspections. Thomas consulted remotely, reviewing plans, answering technical questions, troubleshooting problems. The first shelter went to a single mother with 3 kids. Her heating bills the previous winter had averaged $420 per month. She worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep up. The crew finished her shelter in 7 weeks. Move-in day, she walked through it crying. Her youngest daughter, maybe 6 years old, ran her hand along the river rock wall and looked up at Thomas with eyes too serious for her age. Is it really going to stay warm forever? Thomas knelt down to her level. As long as the sun comes up every morning. The sun always comes up, the girl said with absolute certainty. Then you'll always be warm. March brought requests from places Thomas had never heard of. A reservation in South Dakota, a fishing village in Maine, a collection of homesteads in rural Wyoming, all asking the same question, can you help us build these? Thomas created a training program. 2-day intensive workshops where he taught the core principles to contractors, engineers, and determined amateurs. He held them in Missoula, in Billings, and Bozeman, showed them the math, the material science, the critical details that made the difference between success and failure. A man from Vermont, carpenter by trade, asked about the river rock wall. Do they have to be river rocks, or can we use quarried stone? The shape matters less than the density. You want stone with high thermal mass, granite, sandstone, limestone. Even brick works if you have enough of it. The key is volume, 60 tons minimum. A woman from Minnesota asked about the glazing. What if we can't afford custom panels? Then you build with what you can afford. Salvaged windows, greenhouse glass, even polycarbonate sheets. The angle is what matters most. Get that right, and you're 70% of the way there. He watched them take notes, saw the determination in their faces. These weren't hobbyists. These were people tired of being held hostage by utility companies, tired of watching their paychecks disappear into furnaces that never seemed to heat enough. They were builders in the oldest sense, shelter makers, survival specialists. They were, Thomas repeated across the map. April brought the first failure. A shelter in Wisconsin collapsed during construction when the builder skimped on the foundation depth, hit bedrock at 4 feet and decided that was good enough. The weight of the earth berm crushed the walls. Nobody was hurt, but the family lost their investment and their faith. Thomas got the call from the builder. I followed your plans except for the foundation. I thought 4 feet would be okay. The plans say 8 feet for a reason. You can't shortcut physics, I know. I know, the man's voice was thick with shame. I just wanted to save money on excavation. And now you've lost everything. Thomas softened his tone. I'm sorry it happened, but I need you to understand something. These shelters work because every component is calculated. The foundation depth isn't arbitrary. It's there to transfer the load into stable ground. Skip that and the whole system fails. Can I rebuild? If you do it right this time, and if you let me review the new plans before you break ground. The man agreed. 2 months later, his second attempt stood strong. He sent photos of his family inside thermometer showing 68 degrees on a 50-degree day. The email included one line: "I learned my lesson. Thank you for not giving up on me." Thomas printed the email and pinned it to the wall in Mark II, a reminder that knowledge had to be earned, that there were no shortcuts to understanding. May brought warmth in the end of heating season. Thomas compiled the winter data. Mark II had maintained between 65 and 73 degrees through every day from November to April. Total heating input 0 kilowatt hours. Total cost $0. The shelter had paid for itself and saved utility bills within 5 years. After that, every winter was free. He published the data in a detailed report, complete with hourly temperature logs, weather correlations, and thermal mass performance curves. Posted it on the project website, made it available for download. Within a week, it had been cited in 3 academic papers about sustainable architecture. A professor from MIT called, "We'd like to feature your shelter in our sustainable design curriculum. Would you be willing to do a guest lecture?" Thomas thought about Seattle, about the glass skyscrapers he'd designed for other people, about sitting in conference rooms pitching ideas to billionaires who cared more about aesthetics than efficiency. "I don't lecture anymore, but I'll send you everything I have. Plans, data, lessons learned. Use it however you want." The professor pushed. "We could pay you consulting fee. I don't need money. I need people to understand that winter doesn't have to cost anything. If your students learn that we're even, summer was for refinement." Thomas worked on Mark III, the theoretical design for extreme latitudes. He corresponded with Robert Hutchins in Alaska, incorporating lessons from Fairbanks winters. Increased the thermal mass to 90 tons. Adjusted the glazing angle to 64 degrees. Added a second layer of earth berming for extreme wind protection. The design was elegant, almost beautiful in its efficiency. He sent it to Hutchins in July. The response came back same day. "This is exactly what we need up here. I know 50 families who'd build this tomorrow if they could afford it. So make it affordable. Use local materials. Adapt the design to what Alaska has. The principles don't change, but the implementation should." Hutchins took the advice. By September, there were 7 Alaskan builds underway, each one modified for permafrost conditions, each one adapted to materials available in remote communities. Thomas received updates weekly, photos of construction, questions about thermal bridging in extreme cold, success stories about structures maintaining 70 degrees when exterior temperatures hit -45. The design was spreading, evolving, becoming something larger than one man's project. In October, Emily sat Thomas down in Mark II with a folder full of printouts, emails from builders, news articles, blog posts, academic citations, photos of completed shelters from 43 states. "I've been tracking this. Since you released the plans, there have been 683 documented builds that we know about. Could be more. 683 families not paying heating bills," Thomas said quietly. 683 families that you helped. Emily spread the photos across the floor. "Look at these. Recognize any of them?" Thomas looked. A shelter in New Mexico with solar panels on the roof. One in Oregon with a greenhouse attached. One in North Dakota built partially underground berm covered in native prairie grass. Each one different. Each one adapted to its location, its builders, its purpose. They took what I made and improved it. That's how knowledge works, Dad. You give it away and it grows. Margaret would have said I was crazy to give it away for free. Mom would have said a lot of things. Emily gathered the photos, but she would have been proud. Because you took your grief and turned it into something that keeps people warm. That's alchemy. That's just thermodynamics. Same thing if you ask me. November brought the third winter. Thomas prepared Mark II meticulously, cleaned the glazing, checked the seals, inspected the thermal mass for cracks. The shelter was 2 years old now, proven through 2 full seasonal cycles. This winter would show if the system remained stable over time. The first cold snap came early mid-November. Temperature dropped to 20 degrees overnight. Thomas slept in the shelter, documenting everything as before. The thermal mass had spent the summer and early fall absorbing heat. Now it began releasing. 68 degrees at dawn, 71 by afternoon, stable through the night. The system was holding. If anything, it was performing better than the first 2 years. The thermal mass had fully cured, the earth berm had settled and compacted, the whole structure had reached equilibrium with its environment. Emily came by most evenings after work. They'd sit in the shelter drinking tea, talking about the day. She told him about cases at her law firm. He told her about emails from builders, problems solved, innovations discovered. It was comfortable. It was what Thomas had needed without knowing he needed it. One evening in early December, Emily set down her mug and looked around the shelter with an expression Thomas couldn't read. You know what I realized? This place isn't just about heat. It's a thermal battery. It's a space where you processed losing Mom, where you proved you could still build something meaningful, where you and I reconnected. She gestured at the river rock wall where Margaret's ashes had been scattered into the earth outside. She's part of this place now, part of the warmth. Thomas felt his throat tighten. I scattered her ashes thinking it would give me closure. But it didn't. It just made me realize she's not really gone. She's in the physics, in the heat capacity of stone, in the way sunlight stores itself in mass and releases slowly through dark hours. Dad, that's beautiful and deeply nerdy at the same time. I'm an engineer. It's what we do. The coldest day of the third winter came on January 9th, negative 33 degrees. Not quite as extreme as the previous year, but sustained longer. 3 days of brutal, cold, high pressure, locked in place, no clouds to trap heat. Mark II maintained 70 degrees through all of it. The thermal mass barely noticed. Stone operated on geological timescales. 3 days was nothing. 3 days was a rounding error. Thomas invited Jake and Dale to see it. They drove up from Blackwood County together, brought their families. Jake's daughter was walking now, tottering around the shelter, touching everything. Dale's wife, a quiet woman named Susan, who Thomas had met only once before, sat on the bench and just soaked in the warmth. It's really true, she said after a while. What they say about this place. You can feel it. Feel what Thomas asked. That someone cared enough to prove it was possible. That staying warm doesn't have to cost everything you have. The Thermal Homes Initiative completed its 50th shelter in February. The milestone unit went to a veteran in his 70s who'd been living in a trailer with a broken furnace, wearing 4 layers of clothes indoors through winter. The dedication ceremony was small. Just the crew, the veteran, his daughter, and Thomas. The old man walked through his new shelter with shaking hands, touching the walls like he couldn't believe they were real. He'd lived through Korea, through decades of hard labor in the mining industry, through the death of his wife and the deterioration of his savings. And now he had this. A space that would stay warm without bankrupting him. You built this for me, he said to Thomas. Why I built this for everyone. You just happened to be number 50. The veteran's daughter hugged Thomas. She was crying. My father has been cold for 3 years. 3 years. And you gave him summer back. Physics gave him summer back. I just showed it how. March brought the documentary premiere. Patricia's piece aired on PBS stations across the country. 60 minutes, titled The Thermal Prophet. Thomas watched it with Emily in her living room, uncomfortable seeing himself on screen. The footage was good. The interviews with builders were better. Families showing their shelters, explaining how their lives had changed. But the moment that hit hardest came at the end. Patricia had interviewed the veteran from the 50th shelter, asked him what the shelter meant to him. The old man had looked at the camera with eyes that had seen too much cold, too much darkness. This shelter means I don't have to choose between eating and heating. It means I can spend my fixed income on my grandkids instead of the gas company. It means someone out there understood that being poor shouldn't mean being cold. The documentary went viral in its own right, 2 million streams in the first week. PBS reported it was their most watched program of the season. Thomas's inbox exploded with requests, interviews, speaking engagements, consulting contracts. He ignored most of them, but he did accept an invitation from a tribal council in Montana. They wanted to build thermal shelters on the reservation, asked if Thomas would consult. He said yes immediately. Some projects mattered more than others. April brought the end of the third heating season. Thomas compiled the data again. Mark II had performed identically to the previous years. No degradation, no loss of efficiency. The shelter was stable, self-sustaining, potentially infinite in its operation. He published the 3-year study, downloaded 40,000 times in the first month, referenced in engineering journals, sustainability conferences, architectural reviews. The academic world was slowly acknowledging what Thomas had proven in dirt and stone and glass. Passive solar at northern latitudes wasn't boutique. It was viable. It was reproducible. It worked. May was for teaching. Thomas held 5 workshops that month, training crews from 3 states. He'd refined his approach, boiled the principles down to essentials. Thermal mass solar gain insulation, orientation. Get those 4 things right, and the rest was details. A young couple from Idaho asked him the question he'd heard 100 times now. How much does it really cost to build one? Depends on your labor and materials. If you can do the work yourself, source materials locally may be 8 to 10,000. If you hire it out, 15 to 20. But compare that to heating bills. Average American household spends $1,200 to $1,800 per year on heating. Your payback period is 7 to 10 years. After that, every winter is free money in your pocket. The couple looked at each other. We could do that. We've been saving for a down payment on a house. Maybe we buy land instead and build this. Thomas handed them a USB drive with the complete plans. Everything you need is on here. Build it right. And when you're done, send me a photo. They promised they would. Summer was quiet. Thomas spent most of his time in Mark II enjoying the passive cooling. When exterior temperatures hit 90 degrees, the shelter stayed at 72. The thermal mass worked both ways. In winter, it stored heat. In summer, it stored coolness. The earth berm insulated against extremes in both directions. He thought about Margaret often, about the summer she'd wanted. He'd given it to her in the end, just not the way either of them had expected. She was in the earth now, in the soil that kept the shelter cool in August and warm in January. She was part of the thermal battery, part of the system. Physics doesn't send a bill, he'd told the camera. But it did send gifts, if you understood the language, if you listened to what stone and glass and sunlight were trying to teach you. In September, Thomas turned 64. Emily threw a small party. Jake and Dale drove up with their families. A few neighbors who'd watched the shelter go up. The documentary crew sent a video message. Patricia said they'd been nominated for an award. Thomas didn't care about awards, but he appreciated the thought. They gathered in Mark II. Someone had brought a thermometer-shaped cake as a joke. The frosting read 70 degrees and holding. Thomas cut it while everyone sang off-key. He thought about birthdays before this one. The 62nd when Margaret was still alive, and he was still employed. The 63rd alone in the Blackwood Ridge shelter while a blizzard tried to kill him. This birthday was different. He was surrounded by people who understood what he'd built. Not just the shelter, the community, the knowledge base, the proof that winter was optional. That evening after everyone left, Thomas sat alone in Mark II. He opened his laptop and checked the project website. The download counter had rolled over 200,000 blueprint downloads. The forum had grown to 18,000 members. The photo gallery showed 1,147 completed builds across North America. He'd started this project to fill a void, to prove he could still create, to justify his existence after losing everything that mattered. What he'd ended up creating was a movement, a shift in how people thought about shelter, about heat, about their relationship with winter. Thomas looked at the thermometer on the wall, 70 degrees. Outside, the September evening was cooling toward 50. The shelter would hold this temperature through the night, through the coming autumn, through the winter that would arrive in 8 weeks, and the winter after that, and every winter for as long as the structure stood. He thought about Webb in a federal prison cell, about Clark probably in a different cell, about the coal seam under Blackwood Ridge, still burning patient and unstoppable, consuming the mountain from inside, about the Airstream trailer buried under snow and earth never recovered, about the first shelter, the one he'd driven a truck into, the one that proved you could dig for heat and find it. All of it felt distant now, like someone else's story. Thomas closed the laptop and walked to the glass wall. Stars were emerging in the darkening sky. Millions of fusion reactors, each one pumping out energy that traveled light years to reach Earth. One of them, the closest one, rose every morning and made this shelter possible, made warmth free, made winter negotiable. Margaret had wanted a summer that never ended. He'd built her one, and then he'd built 1,000 more for people he'd never meet. Thomas walked the perimeter slowly one final time, running his hand along the river rock wall where Margaret's ashes had become part of the earth. The concrete floor was smooth under his bare feet. The glass reflected the stars in fragmented patterns. Every surface was familiar, known, understood. He sat on the bench Emily had built, the one where they drunk tea and talked about grief and the strange alchemy of turning sorrow into shelter. He thought about the night he'd slept here in negative 38-degree cold, watching the thermometer hold steady, proving that the impossible was merely improbable until you built it. Margaret would have laughed at all this. The shelter, the book, the movement, to her, to warmth, to the idea that summer was a love letter, to her, to warmth, to the idea that summer could last forever if you were stubborn enough and knew enough thermodynamics. Thomas stood, checked the thermometer one final time. 72 degrees. Outside, the September evening was cooling towards 60. The shelter would hold its temperature through the night, through the coming autumn, through every winter for as long as the sun rose. He turned off the light and walked to the door, paused, turned back. "Thank you," he said quietly, to the shelter, to Margaret, to physics, to whatever combination of grief and stubbornness had driven him to dig into frozen Montana earth 3 years ago. The shelter didn't answer, didn't need to. The thermometer said everything that mattered. Thomas closed the door and walked toward the main house where Emily waited with dinner and conversation and the comfortable warmth of family. Behind him, Mark too sat in the gathering darkness, a testament to the idea that the best heat is the kind you don't have to burn anything to get. And somewhere in the earth beneath it, scattered in soil and stone, Margaret kept her summer.